Hello, 8th graders. I hope you've been having a productive couple of days without me in science class. I'm making this video to go over the evidence for activity 9.2. It's really important that you understand the evidence and the conclusions we can draw from 9.2 because you're going to end up developing a model from this lesson that you can apply to other species that we're going to study, other changes in populations. So we'll do an activity with finches and another one with giraffes and another one with mosquitoes. So it's important that you understand the patterns that occur in all changes in population. So first I'd like to start by going over what you should have now in your activity 9.2 organizer that you can see on the screen. In both the evidence column and the making sense column, I'm hoping that this isn't going to take you a long time to make a lot of edits, that you can just listen to the answers that I go over and make any small changes that you need to. Please pause the video and feel free to rewind if you need to hear something again. So in activity 9.2, the first section are the first sections A and B are the pollution studies, and on the evidence side, you were looking at, for pollution study number 1 for section A, you were looking at this map right here, and in the evidence column, you need to have something like, in the areas where there was more industrial pollution, there were more carbonaria moths, and in rural areas where there was less pollution, there were more typica moths. And then on your making sense side, I'm hoping that you recognize that pollution might have something to do with the differences in where each type of moth is found. So you don't have to have those exact words, but something close to that. In the next section, the pollution study number 2, there were several graphs to look at, and in the evidence column on your organizer, hopefully you have something like, the evidence showed that the more pollution there was, the less lichens there were on the trees. So you can see here more pollution. As the pollution grows, the number of lichens go down. And then also, you should have noticed that when there's less lichen, there are more carbonaria moths. So as the number of lichen on the trees go up, the number of carbonaria moths go down. So as the number of lichen go down, the number of carbonaria moths go up. You can say that either way. And then in your making sense column, hopefully you have noticed that there is maybe a connection between the number of lichens and the type of moth that's found there. So if there's a lot of pollution, the typica moth numbers would go down and the carbonaria would go up because the number of lichens on the trees affects which kind of moth is there. The next section are 2 predation studies, and for the first one, you had to look at a couple of moths. The first predation study has to do with the live moths. The second one is the one where they put the dead moths on the trees. So in experiment number 1, this is section C on your organizer. In the evidence column, you need to have something like the data show that a larger proportion of typica moths were eaten in the polluted areas, and more carbonaria were eaten when there was less pollution, and also that a greater proportion of carbonaria survived in the polluted areas, and more typica survived where there was less pollution. And hopefully in your making sense column, you were able to say something like, there seems to be a connection between how well the predators can see the moths. So the lighter moths, the typica moths, could be seen more easily on the polluted trees and did not survive as well. And the darker moths did not survive as well on the trees where more lichen were in the non-polluted areas. Now, if you didn't make all of those connections, if you didn't put all those pieces together, like the color of the moth and the predators and the lichen, if you didn't put all of those together, that's okay. But you may have had enough information at that point to put all those pieces together. But you're trying to look at the evidence, and in the evidence column, just make observations, just basically record facts that you see. And then in the right-hand side, like, what is your interpretation of that? What do you think that means for the moth population? For predation experiment number 2, this is group D. You are hopefully noticing that the data show that more Typica moths were preyed on in the more polluted areas. This is the study where they put the dead moths on each of the trees. And so you should have something like, the data show that more Typica moths were preyed on in more polluted areas, and more Carbonaria were preyed on in the less polluted areas. And then for your interpretation, hopefully you have something like that the data seem to show that the moths were easier to see, where the moths that were easier to see were preyed on more. So color has something to do with whether the moths are living or dying. The next section is the pollution reduction section, and you had to look at this graph right here, both of these graphs, and hopefully in your evidence column you have something that says that the first graph shows that in the polluted woods there was a higher proportion of Carbonaria in 1959, but by 2003 the proportion had reversed itself. So you can see that happening here. It's like going the opposite direction. And there were more Typica. So keep in mind, this is like later on. This is showing 1959 to 2003, so this is like more recent. Because we know that at the beginning of this lesson, we read about how the number of Carbonaria had gone up and the number of Typica had gone down. But now this is fast forwarding ahead in the future, and it's saying after the Clean Air Act was put in place, they noticed that the Typica started to rise again, and hopefully you're saying in your making sense side that there seems to be a connection between how polluted the air is and the proportion of Carbonaria to Typica. The more polluted the air is, the more Carbonaria there are, and as the air improves, the more Typica there are. And to go back to that evidence column, for the second graph, you could say something like that the graph shows that at the industrial and intermediate sites there were proportionately more Carbonaria in both of those places than there were in the 1990s. And when England started to reduce pollution in the 1950s, and from the 1970s to the present, the air has become less polluted. And then the very last section on the inheritance experiment. Hopefully this one was easier for you to figure out, since this is something we covered a lot in Learning Set 2. On the evidence column, hopefully after reading this information or hearing it from your partners, you were able to say something like that the evidence in the chart shows that the offspring of these breeding experiments showed the same kind of pattern that we saw in the plants and the human data about inherited traits. So we see if two Carbonaria are crossed, they can have either type of variation in their offspring. If one of each is crossed, there can be either type of variation. But when a Typica and a Typica are crossed, there are no Carbonaria. They're all Typica. So Typica and Typica can only make Typica. So hopefully, your wheels are spinning and you're thinking, Typica is probably the one that is the recessive allele. So hopefully you're recognizing that it's following the same model. And then in your interpretation or your making sense column, you can say something like that the data showed that the color of the moss is inherited, that the pattern fits the model that we've seen in Learning Set 2 and matches what we saw with the human and the plant data. The next thing you were asked to do yesterday was to answer this making sense question, and it asks you to write out a chain of cause and effect. I heard that some of you had a little bit of confusion about that. That was a little kind of a difficult task for you. If you look at these 5 different elements that you're supposed to include in this chain of cause and effect, really all it's asking you to do is to take those 5 things and to put them in order, and the order should be a cause and then an effect that follows it. So you're sequencing them in the order they happened, and when you have them all in order, for each of these items, the next thing should be caused by the previous thing. So just to show you an example of what not to do, if we were to put lichens and trees before pollution, we would be saying that whatever happened with the lichen caused whatever happened with the pollution. And I'm hoping you're realizing, like, Ms. Papa, that's not what happened. That's the wrong order. I meant for that to be the wrong order. So when you're looking at your order that you created yesterday, or maybe you were a little confused that you were supposed to put them in order, but when you're looking at putting these in order, I want you to make sure that whatever the first thing is causes the second thing, and whatever the second thing is causes the third thing, and whatever the third thing is causes the fourth thing. Just go back and look at your answer from yesterday and see if that makes sense. And see if you think they're in the right order or not, and if you think they're not, try to make some changes, and when you're finished with that, you can get out the worksheet that you were given that looks like a little flowchart. And then I'm going to go over the answers to that flowchart so that you can double check whether or not you were correct with your chain of cause and effect yesterday when you were answering the making sense. So once you're finished with this video, I want you to start the second video.